I'm on it, Mom.
I shouldn't laugh. We've got to go out and do another risk assessment.
Welcome everybody to the webinar, New Developments in Attachment. Do put yourself on mute. We've gone for the approach of having you all in the room rather than go for the webinar format. To try and make it a bit more user-friendly, but we do need you to be on mute. Okay, I'm Luke Gagan and I'm Head of Policy and Research at BASW, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Sarah Foster, who, among other things, teaches social workers and guidance and counselling courses at the University of Northumbria. It's also a real pleasure to welcome Robbie Duschinsky, who also taught social work at Northumbria University for, I think, about 10 years, and has recently been appointed Professor at the School of Primary Healthcare at Cambridge University. We're also being joined by Richard Devine, who's a consultant social worker who is with Bath and North East Somerset Children's Services, and also Lianne Bakkum, who is Assistant Professor, and I'm going to make a mess of this, Vrije University at Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So great to have you all here. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Robbie, who I think is going to talk first, and we're going to have a presentation for the first half, and then the second half, questions and discussion. So Robbie, over to you.
Hello everyone. Sarah, you're happy to get the slide set up? Good. Can everyone see that okay? Right, lovely. Well, so lovely to see you all. Wonderful to have the chance to talk to you about this. Sarah's got a chest infection, otherwise she'd be presenting, because I'm going to be partly presenting her doctoral work.
You're on mute, Robbie.
If you've got thoughts or questions, then please do email Sarah. The email address is there. So let's kick off. I guess the premise here is that attachment has a long-standing place within social work theory and education. So, for example, in 1955, Bowlby presented to the Association for Psychiatric Social Workers about how important attachment would be for work, for social work with people with mental health difficulties. And at least since then, there's been considerable interest from the profession, real kind of a sense that attachment has a kind of special place for social work knowledge. But there's really a considerable debate in the field about what place attachment should have for social work. There's been some major advocates, so for example, David Shemmings at Kent, and major critics, so for example, Sue White at Sheffield, saying really there isn't really a place for attachment theory and research in social work. It's not really important. Now, it's also quite a politicized topic. So, for example, with the NARI review, I know this is some years ago now, but saying that social work education should teach more attachment and less injustice to social work students. I guess kind of politicizing the position of attachment theory within social work education. I think the thing that struck us was that this whole debate has been very often around a strangely antiquated version of attachment theory and research, kind of pre-1980s attachment theory and research, focused on a few key ideas. So, for example, that it's the mother-child bond that's central, that really what's relevant is categories of attachment, and that these categories can determine later development. In fact, actually, even towards the end of their lives, Bowlby and Ainsworth didn't really recognize that as a kind of their position at all. And they regretted that that image of their work had been taken by social workers and other professionals. So to understand this situation, we undertook some research. Firstly, we researched attitudes among social workers in 2 local authorities towards attachment theory. And then we consulted with attachment researchers themselves about what they thought might be most relevant to social workers from their studies. So in this talk, we're going to summarize the findings of these 2 consultations. We'd love to hear your thoughts. There's going to be some time for discussion in the second half, but we'd be delighted if you email to get in touch to offer your reflections, where we'll have more time afterwards to respond. If you put a question or a thought in the chat, together with your email address, if we don't have time to respond during the session today, we'll reply to you by email. And likewise, we're planning to write up a version of these ideas as a paper. So you don't need to take notes. We're going to have a summary of this that we've written. If you'd like a copy of that summary, just put your email into the chat and then we'll send that over to you afterwards. So the first kind of set of findings is from Sarah's doctoral thesis, researching attitudes from social workers towards attachment theory and research. And what she found is that many social workers see attachment as important. I mean, that's reflected, of course, by so many people here today, you know, the positive energy towards finding out more about attachment in this room as well. But many social workers don't feel confident in their knowledge, was one of the key findings from Sarah's doctoral work. And a common theme was practitioners were often relying on outdated ideas about attachment from before the 1980s and not really aware of where they could access more up-to-date information, how to go about that. And sometimes practitioners were relying actually just on the connotations of the words attachment or sensitivity, rather than what Bowlby or Ainsworth had meant by these concepts. And we were struck by these findings. It motivated us to approach the international attachment research community and ask them what they think should be on the curriculum for developments since the 1980s. And we set the expectation that what should be there should amount to no more than 3 hours taught and 3 hours of reading. So really just kind of the core thing for the curriculum, not necessarily a more advanced thing, which might be relevant for some of you. So what we're going to be summarizing here in the first half of the presentation is 8 ideas that the research community feels are particularly relevant to social work. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do these resonate? Do these not resonate? Do these seem like we're on the right lines? Let's hope. We really hope this could be the beginning of a conversation. We'd love to hear from you. So a first concept is the idea of a safe haven. Here is the idea that infants and children tend to want to seek one or more of their familiar caregivers as a safe haven, as somewhere to turn when hurt, anxious, distressed, or alarmed. But so do adults, even if this is expressed differently. So, for example, mutual availability by text or by phone for support between friends or romantic partners. Bowlby thought this was the heart of attachment theory. And in fact, actually, this is really what he was trying to point to with the idea of attachment. Safe haven is a more specific and less ambiguous term, less easy to misdirect attention. So, for example, sometimes attachment can get treated as equivalent to the whole relationship, rather than some specific part of it, really kind of confusing what we mean by attachment. Towards the end of his life, Bowlby wrote in a letter that he'd wished he'd not referred to attachment because people all got the wrong idea. He said, well, maybe we should refer to care seeking or the safe haven as really the core idea that he was trying to get to. Now, one of the ideas that I think is really kind of interesting about the idea of the safe haven, and it has been long part of why Bowlby thought it was relevant for social workers, is it implies that caregivers aren't interchangeable for children once they've got an established relationship with them. That children need substantial time and interaction to build up their sense of trust in the caregiver's availability and responsiveness to their needs. It also indicates that long-term separations from children, long-term separations from caregivers, for example, due to incarceration or hospitalization, that can weaken children's trust in their caregivers' availability and responsivity, which in turn may hinder their development. And where a child's relationship with caregivers has had to be ended, so for example, to protect a child from maltreatment, the idea of the safe haven suggests that children can develop expectations about the availability and responsivity of new caregivers in times of need, though this can take time and requires continuity of care from the new caregivers. So that's the idea of the safe haven. A second idea that this kind of group of researchers felt would be relevant for social workers was the idea of security. So security here has a kind of technical meaning. Attachment theory research have found that children develop expectations based on their day-to-day experiences about the relative availability and responsibility of their familiar to caregivers in times of need. So where children have learnt from experience that a caregiver will provide help when needed, this sense of trust is called security by researchers. And the person providing this sense of security is called a secure base. That's a term from Ainsworth. Where children have less trust that a caregiver will be able to or is engaged to provide help when needed, this is called insecurity. Now, there's a stereotype about attachment that these expectations are set in stone. They're not set in stone. And that's one of the important developments since the 1980s, is really empirical evidence showing that when that children's expectations can and do change when caregivers revise their response to children's bids for comfort and protection, though there may be a lag. For instance, empirical work showing that where a caregiver experiences stressful events in their life or becomes more isolated from friends and family, this is generally associated with increased child caregiver insecurity. It's really easy, research community wanted to emphasize, to either overstate or understate claims about the impact of attachment relationships. And I'm sure that you guys coming onto this call have at some point heard overstated or understated claims about the relevance of attachment. In part, this is because excessive weight can be placed on single studies with extreme findings, which aren't actually representative. Looking across different studies, the associations between children's expectations about their caregivers' availability and later outcomes, the associations are highly notable, and they give a clear signal that these experiences are important. But the strength of the association absolutely doesn't imply that all or even most children with insecure attachment experiences will necessarily have negative outcomes, or vice versa. It's just tendencies in that direction, but it's by no means set in stone or kind of very direct. So a third idea that the attachment community felt would be particularly relevant for social workers is one that I think is quite contrary to stereotypes about attachment, which is the idea of the network of relationships. This is the idea that children are predisposed to identify a number of caregivers as potential safe havens or secure bases, provided they have sufficient interaction with them to experience these caregivers as familiar. Attachment theory and research hold that multiple relationships that serve as a safe haven or secure base for the child, somewhere where the child feels they can go when they need or that's available to support them, that these are an asset for children, and they don't typically disturb one another unless one relationship represents a source of threat to another relationship. And it's a shame because attachment theory is often assumed, following Bowlby's early writings in the 1950s, to emphasize the importance of child-mother relationships at the expense of other child-caregiver relationships. But already by the 1970s, Bowlby was surprised that people took this idea from his work. He assumed that people had read his later work and knew that he'd abandoned that idea, and really that had placed much more emphasis on the idea of a network. Having access to a network of potential safe havens and secure base relationships, it increases the likelihood that a child will have someone that they feel free to turn to when they need to, someone who's going to they feel is going to satisfy their needs. Furthermore, the support for childcare provided by additional network members, so for example, grandparents, can increase the capacity of individuals within the network to be available as safe haven or secure base for a child. That is to say, that the network actually helps each caregiver give more because they're under less pressure, according to some recent research. Researchers have found that the care provided by fathers and mothers, in fact, actually carries an equal weight, well, similar weight, for children's later behavioural development, that there's no statistical difference in the amount of prediction from the care given by fathers compared to the care given by mothers, which again is kind of contrary to the stereotype about attachment being focused on mothers, and that was part of Bowlby's story in the 1950s. Now, an interesting finding here, this is from a recent paper, is that compared to children with one secure attachment relationship and one insecure relationship, children with two secure attachment relationships have fewer behavioral difficulties and stronger language skills, underlining that actually the network is more beneficial than just having one secure relationship. In general, children who have no secure attachment relationships with any members of their network are the most at risk of risk of poor adjustment or mental health difficulties, according to this research. Another concept that's been put forward by the attachment community as perhaps relevant is an emphasis on stable, non-abusive family-based care. Institutional care, according to a whole variety of different forms of research, has a number of features that seem to interfere with the ability of children to experience that there are people available to them in times of need. And these may include, for example, high staff-child ratios, staff turnover, qualities of professional distance. Child welfare professionals, when making decisions about permanency, the decisions are really complicated and a whole variety of factors need to be involved. What the attachment community was suggesting might be a particular thing to consider is the way in which institutional care and highly unstable caregiving relationships may prevent or hinder children's access to relationships that can provide a safe haven or secure base for their development. And that when children do experience non-familial care, so for example, incarcerated young people, professionals working with these children may want to consider proactively thinking about what safe haven or secure base access can be maintained for those young people or is feasible in those situations. A fifth concept that was put forward by the attachment researchers as perhaps relevant from our consultation is the idea of sensitivity. This is the idea that children are more likely to trust in the availability and responsibility of their caregiver as a safe haven and secure base if this caregiver is able to identify and respond to the child's intentions and needs. And this is especially the case for any signals that the child is hurt, anxious, distressed, or alarmed. Attachment researchers wanted the social work community to kind of be aware that the attachment researchers are using the term sensitivity in quite a distinct sense, not to mean kind of generally warm or loving care, but something specific, which means the ability of the caregiver to perceive and accurately interpret the child's signals. And that it's actually that element of being able to identify and respond to the child's signals more than, for example, being warm and friendly, smiling at the child, that seems to be particularly important for the attachment development. And interventions that focus on improving caregiver sensitivity have been shown to improve children's expectations about caregivers' availability, increasing their observed reliance on the caregiver as a safe haven, for example, as well as their developmental outcomes, really pointing to the importance of this idea of sensitivity. And also in the context of child protection assessments, researchers have also examined caregivers' responses to interventions that improve sensitivity. Findings suggest that this response can offer insight into the caregiver's capacity to improve their parenting. So this is from a trial in Canada, which found that the capacity of a caregiver to become more sensitive was associated with better social care outcomes a year later. A sixth concept that the attachment community suggested might be relevant is mentalizing. So beyond observable behavior, researchers have also looked at the psychological processes that influence whether caregivers are available as a safe haven or secure base for their children. Mentalizing refers to a person's capacity to consider the thoughts and feelings of others in making sense of their own and others' behavior and experience. And in this case, the capacity of the caregiver to think about what the experience of their child is. And attachment researchers thought that this might be particularly relevant for social work, where attending to helping the caregiver think about what the child's experience might be could be an important part of working with caregivers. And that practitioners may gain insight into the dynamics of a family by considering how caregivers seem to think about the experience of their child. A seventh concept that the attachment community thought might be relevant was the idea of alarming behavior by caregivers. Researchers in attachment have found that this can have a particularly negative effect on a child's expectations of their caregiver as a safe haven or secure base. So alarming behavior by a caregiver, so for example, caregiving behavior that's frightening, will have negative impact for a variety of reasons. But what attachment researchers are saying is that if a child associates their caregiver with alarm, this can make it difficult to use that caregiver as a safe haven or as a secure base when they feel that they need help. If a child experiences their caregiver as alarming, this doesn't by any means indicate that the child has been abused by their caregiver. There's various things that can alarm children in caregivers' behaviour, depending on their age and situation. A feature here that is drawn out by the research literature is that a caregiver can be very sensitive, but nonetheless sometimes alarming. So, for example, a mother who's experienced sexual assault may find her son alarming, but only during nappy changes and bath time, but otherwise be capable of being quite sensitive. So the implication is that practitioners may want to kind of keep an eye out both for insensitive care and alarming caregiving behaviours, and recognise that the research literature seems to think that these are quite different. Researchers have actually developed an assessment tool for use by applied practitioners that can help identify alarming caregiving behaviours. Their work is still underway validating this. Finally, an eighth concept introduced by the attachment research after the 1980s, and that might not have spread through into the kind of common image of attachment research, is the importance of poverty and adversity for the attachment relationship. The idea here is that experiences of poverty and other socioeconomic stresses can reduce the attention adults have for parenting, decrease positive feelings and increase feelings of helplessness and fear. And as can be expected, such stresses are therefore associated with less sensitive caregiving, greater frequency of alarming caregiving behaviours, and reduced capacity for mentalising. It then makes sense that family adversity would be linked to greater likelihood of attachment insecurity. The NARI review argued that attachment theory implies that social workers should focus on parents and their behaviour rather than the circumstances of families to make improvements in the lives of children. The attachment research community wanted to highlight that that's a false opposition. Any circumstance that makes parents routinely feel helpless or afraid is likely to have a negative impact on their children's perception of the parents' availability and responsivity in times of need. So, to conclude, I guess our research, talking to practitioners, talking to attachment researchers, has highlighted that there's been loads of development in attachment theory since the 1980s, and that that some of this might be of particular interest to the profession. There seems to have been some disconnect between attachment research and the social work community. Says that some of these ideas may be completely blindingly obvious to you, and so therefore that's also telling us something, that the attachment research community hasn't kind of locked into what is actually already known by the profession. Our proposal is we might consider moving on from teaching and focusing on infant-mother bonding, categories of insecure attachment, determining later outcomes, as if that was the heart of the theory. Even late in life, Bowlby and Ainsworth didn't think that was the heart of their theory. And today, attachment theory and research is quite different. It emphasizes networks of relationships, not just mothers and infants. It highlights the effects of poverty and adversity, not just processes going on inside the family. Rather than focusing on categories of insecurity, the important thing that contemporary researchers seem particularly focused on and particularly interested for practitioners to know is to think about whether children feel supported and trust in the people they have around them to help them when they're in times of need, more than putting children into boxes. So can we urge, this is just intended to begin a conversation. It's not intended anyway as kind of the final word on this. We'd love to have further conversation with you, to hear your thoughts. One of the reasons why I went kind of rapid fire through that was a chance to have some conversation now, to have some discussion. And that could be in the rest of this half an hour or after the call, because I think that the proposals from the attachment research community about what's what the latest research is suggesting, could be interesting, but we need to have that conversation with the profession about what they would find valuable. Thank you very much. Good. So Lianne has been monitoring the chat. Lianne, are there any questions that you feel you can draw us attention to for our second half?
There aren't any questions yet.
Okay, so in which case, Rich, Lianne, as people who kind of engaged in this, social workers and educating practitioners, do you have any thoughts? Rich, do you want to have a go first?
Yeah, I just have a question for you and Sarah, if her voice is up for it, which is about, at the beginning you talked about the research that found that a lot of social workers didn't feel especially confident in using attachment and some of the associated terms. And when they did use the terms, they seemed to use them more colloquially than in any kind of technical sense. And I just wondered how that fitted with other research around social workers' use of attachment in practice.
Sarah, do you want to nod or shake your head, or how do you want to do this? With a chest infection, it's not easy.
I'll give it a go, and apologies if I have to mute partway through if I start coughing, everyone. Yes, lovely question. I think from what I found before I did my recent research with social workers was that quite a lot of the literature wasn't based on actually talking to social workers, but on what people thought social workers knew about attachment theory. And quite a lot of that literature was expressing concerns that social workers may be over-focused on the categories of insecure attachment. Whereas what I found was that while that was the image of attachment theory that was often reaching social workers via books and teaching, a lot of social workers were expressing dissatisfaction with that for practice and with the value of that for their practice. And that those who did know more of the concepts that have been highlighted by Robbie today were actually finding attachment theory was more useful for their practice.
Thank you.
I'm seeing a few comments and questions in the chat.
Wonderful.
Two people have commented that this is very relevant for fostering and foster care. So Roxanne wanted to ask something. She's saying that it is very relevant for sure, but she wanted to ask how it all ties into the age of a child. For very young children, they generally have less adults around. Does this matter? And can secure attachments develop at any time, or are they often based on the early relationships of a child?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. So in Bowlby's early work, he thought that the early relationships were particularly critical. And later research hasn't disagreed with that completely. Early relationships are particularly powerful, but actually later research has found that prediction to later outcomes is stronger after infancy. And in fact, actually, it's considerably better prediction from children aged 3 to 4 compared to infancy, predicting later outcomes, which, Bowlby was right then to say, childhood is important. We can definitely agree with that. But actually later research has kind of shown that actually early infancy isn't so central. And indeed, research on interventions based on attachment theory have found that the most effective interventions are those that target children in middle childhood rather than in infancy. I'm sure you've come across ideas of early intervention, focus on the early years. It's really interesting. There's a whole variety of different sources of evidence, but the attachment evidence, convergent evidence from attachment, has highlighted the importance of middle childhood and adolescence in predicting outcomes, in being the kind of prime time for an attachment-based intervention. That's not to say that infancy isn't really important and a useful time to make interventions. And in fact, actually, an intervention made in infancy will result in more years of the child benefiting from that intervention, which then has an advantage. But by no means is it implied that you've got infancy and unless that goes right, you're done for, which I think is an image that some people took from Bowlby's early writings and doesn't fit with research evidence as I've seen it. Sarah, do you have anything else to add on this? There's a question. Can secure attachments develop at any time? Roxanne asks. Lianne, do you want to tackle that one? Or shall I take it?
Oh, I see. Yes, the second question of Roxanne. Yes. Yeah. So according to the theory, secure attachments can develop at any time. So there's evidence from the literature. For example, children who have been adopted or have ended up in foster care, that they can develop secure attachments with their foster parents, even if they didn't have secure attachments with their previous caregivers.
So one way of dealing with a question like this is to think that when people talk about attachment, they mean trust in someone available for them in times of need. And if you've had experiences that make it difficult to trust, then it makes it more difficult to form a secure attachment. But trust isn't a finite resource. You don't run out of it. It's just more difficult to access with time, as time goes by. Or if you do form a trusting relationship, there may be undertow of other expectations that kind of hedge in sometimes. But certainly it's not implied by either theory or research in contemporary attachment research that you can't access security.
So there are more and more questions coming in. So there has been another question about from Ross. They're saying that the criticism of social work evidence in the family court appears to have significantly impacted the application of use in social work. The question is, what would be the best way to support social workers in confidently talking about and writing about these concepts? And Francis is replying that they've been told to not use the word attachment in reports, and it's only a theory. Do you have any comments on that, Robbie or Sarah?
Sarah, do you have enough voice for this? Because I know you've been thinking deeply about it.
Hi. Yes, I think one of the important things here is to think what attachment theory offers, and I think the point about it being a theory rather than evidence is a really useful one. So to me, the value of attachment theory is in asking better questions rather than providing the answers. And so in that vein, I see attachment theory and the kinds of concepts that have been raised today as working in the back room to help you do the processes that you would be doing anyway. So to help you think about what questions to ask with a family, what to observe in a family, what to pay particular attention to, and that it's that evidence that you collect from that specific family using attachment theory to inform what evidence you gather that is what is useful to take to court. So I think I agree, and it's something that came up a lot in my research about people feeling warned off or unable to talk about attachment in court. But actually, I think we're maybe looking in the wrong place, and that attachment theory is useful for providing the ideas that we would then describe rather than to use the terms themselves.
Thank you, Sarah. There are more and more questions coming in, so I'm gonna have to choose one bit considering the time. So there's been a question about anti-racist perspectives on attachment theory. So B's asking, is there any research that has developed attachment theory from anti-racist perspectives and considered experience of Black communities? And Shireen wanted to ask this considering families specifically from minority groups.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, so there was a special issue on anti-racist perspectives and attachment research in attachment and the journal Attachment Human Development. I think it was last year, if anyone happens to be able to correct that. But again, I'll send that to, if you put your email address in the chat, a link to that question, I can circulate a link to that. My impression of the evidence, though it is complex, is that attachment is only one component of a child's development, and only one component of family life. And so I'm not making any claims for other aspects of how practitioners should be working with minoritized communities. But specifically in relation to attachment, my impression is that the evidence has indicated that has two findings that I think are particularly important here. One is that being a minoritized community is associated with insecure attachment, but the reason for this is because being a minoritized community is associated with poor socioeconomic status. and that actually, if you take into account a family's the adversity they're facing, there's no association between attachment and ethnicity. That is to say that measures of attachment, the attachment research community doesn't seem to have very much to say about ethnicity, because it doesn't seem to be, there don't seem to be any particularly relevant associations. That the idea here is that trust in the availability of caregivers can be formed in different ways, in different families, in different contexts. There's a whole variety of different ways of doing that. But when you have a family who are under strain from socioeconomic pressures, which minoritized families are more often, that makes it more difficult for that family to form relationships where the child feels that their caregiver is available. That's one set of findings. A second is a meta-analysis by Chantal Cyr and colleagues in 2010, which I find really thought-provoking. So what this study, they looked across a heap of different studies to look at aggregate effects. And what they found was that when you have ethnic minority status on its own, there's no association with anything particularly notable in the attachment literature. But when you add in other forms of adversity, when these start to hit each other to compound, so for example, parent who's using substances, family that's living in poverty, when you add things together, being an ethnic minority then increases prediction of insecure attachment and disorganized attachment. The idea here is that being an ethnic minority in itself doesn't really have so much bearing for the ability of that family to support children to feel that there's someone there for them in times of need. But if you're a minoritized family and are also facing other difficulties, and then also have stigma and social exclusion on top of that, that can really be a hindrance to the children in the family feeling that there's someone there for them. So these are really partial answers to the question, because actually there's so much more to be done here. But in the space of the few minutes that I've got to address this huge question, those are two findings that I found particularly thought-provoking, that actually what appears to be ethnic differences is actually to do with socioeconomic status. And secondly, that ethnic minority status does have implications, but only when you roll it together with other difficulties that families are facing, which suggests that it's to do with the effects of stigma on already marginalized families.
Thanks very much, Robbie. So there have been multiple questions about the link between attachment and development of attachment and neurodiversity. Can one of you comment on that? It's not my area of expertise.
If you've got interest in this, pop your name and email address in the chat. You know, Lianne and I can pull together some resources on that. Answering just briefly, my impression is that there's a few difficulties here for the research literature. The attachment measures were developed on neurotypic populations, and so therefore the question about whether or not they can be used with diverse populations, needs to be dealt with carefully. But what I'm struck by is that time and again, associations are in the expected direction. So for children with autism, with intellectual disabilities, caregiving that's sensitive is associated with more positive child outcomes. Where children feel that there's someone there for them, whatever that's going to mean for that child, they're more likely to have positive outcomes, which means that this population will need to be thought about very carefully in terms of assessment. And there may be particular differences. So, for example, for children with multiple and profound intellectual disabilities, where it's difficult for them to even recognize their caregiver, clearly that's going to be a potential obstacle to be able to form a secure relationship. But if children can identify someone who they can trust and turn to in times of need, that can be done for children with Downs, that can be done for children with all kinds of differences in terms of neurodiversity. That's I guess, my sense of the headline of that literature. Lianne, Sarah, Rich, any other thoughts on neurodiversity and attachment?
Nothing to add on that one from me.
No, I think you did very well summarizing this.
It's a big literature, yeah.
So there was a question about adults from Carrie Phillips, and they're saying that they love the research that looks at how adults make sense of their childhood relationships, and that the sense making is more important to adult relationships than the quality of the attachment itself. And they were wondering if the researchers you spoke to talked about adults much.
Oh, wonderful question. That's brilliant. Okay, so where to start? Okay, so clearly adults have had experiences in childhood that shape their expectations and how they feel in relationships. As we've discussed, the key thing that Bowlby thought was important was whether a child or an adult feels that there's someone there for them in times of need, whether there's people that are there to support them. And that's really what he was trying to emphasize. And our early experiences will certainly shape that. But as you say, how we interpret our experiences, what sense we make of them, is also profoundly important. Sarah, do you want to say a word about your PhD on this front? Because you kind of took this and ran with it, didn't you?
Yes, I think one of the things that was interesting here, and I agree that the adult literature is really useful, is some social workers talked about how when they've tried to use attachment theory, they found it quite oppressive and blaming of parents. And conversely, some other social workers talked about how they'd found attachment theory really useful for removing blame and shame and working in a very holistic, whole family approach. And in my research, what I found is that it was the social workers who had that lifespan perspective on attachment theory and were thinking about the parents as people who also had needs, who were also dealing with challenges and working to support parents rather than just focusing on the children or seeing attachment theory as just focused on the child and the parents simply there as someone to meet the child's needs, who were finding attachment theory helpful in that way. So I suppose in summary, it wasn't that some social workers were working in a blaming way. It was that all wanted to work in my research in a more whole family focused way, but some saw the value of attachment theory for that because they were more aware of that lifespan side of it.
I'd like to add something to that, which is one of the most exciting kind of revelatory ideas for me from learning about attachment, particularly from the adult attachment interview, was that it's not, and Robbie alluded to this, it's not necessarily your experiences that define your functioning later on in adulthood. It's the sense that you've made of those experiences which influence the way in which you function in the present. And so there is an opportunity to revise your expectations or the way in which you've come to make sense of those experiences. And if you revise how you've made sense of those experiences, it can change your functioning in your relationships with people, especially with your partner and with your children. So it's like a really optimistic finding that's born out of the attachment literature, is that it's not necessarily experiences that define you, but the way in which you come to make sense of them. And by revising the sense you've made of them, you can change your functioning for better.
So there are a few questions about the internal working model of attachment. So Juan is asking, is the concept of internal working model of attachment rather more dependent on context as opposed to a fixed internal model?
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so the idea of the internal working model was introduced by Bowlby in the 60s for a particular function to try to integrate cognitive and developmental psychology. But we're over half a century later, and the term internal working model introduced for a particular purpose, really, I think it can be quite confusing. I think it's really important that we update it. And since the mid-1980s, attachment researchers have been increasingly dropping the term. One term that attachment researchers use instead is expectations. But that's really what attachment theorists and researchers were thinking about all along, is expectations about your caregiver or the people around you, and whether they're going to be available in times of need and whether they're supporting you. So therefore, the idea of internal working model is a kind of specialist idea, that kind of something that gets set in stone over time. That is an idea that's kind of in circulation in some quarters, but really isn't an idea that attachment researchers use at all these days. More frequently, people do think about expectations and trust as shaped by your early experiences, of course, but completely capable of change with time for the reasons that Rich gave, which is that, you know, we're sense-making creatures that can change our impression of what things mean, and what impact they have for us. Trust doesn't come for free, and the more difficult experiences you've had, the more it's an uphill struggle to learn to trust and to stabilize that trust and to keep it going, even in the context of the difficulties that adult lives have. So that is absolutely true. And certainly something that I find interesting is recent research showing that once a secure attachment is made, people tend to hold on to it. But once an insecure attachment is made, that's less stable comparatively than a secure attachment. That we seem to be built to be able to, if once we've felt something is secure, hold on to it as secure, more than once we've experienced something as insecure to continue to distrust it, which I think is a kind of thought-provoking finding from recent meta-analyses. Rich, Lianne, Sarah, anything else on stability of internal working models? It's certainly an idea that got really like a lot of play in Bowlby's early work, that the expectation that these experiences of the caregiver would be very stable. It's not really where the research has suggested. My impression personally is that actually it's caregiving that tends to be quite stable, and that artificially produces the impression that children's expectations are stable. And so, for example, there was a recent study, again, I can circulate this, that I think is really interesting, by Lianne. I'll get this and send this around. It's a really lovely paper, which looked at, if you look at caregiving and look at children's expectations of caregiving, which is it that predicts the child's outcomes better? So if you look at observations of caregivers compared to the child's internal working model, which is going to predict outcomes? And what the researchers found is that they both predict later outcomes. But if you look at it together, actually, it's the caregiving behavior that predicts both attachment and the later outcomes, implying that the internal working model is a secondary effect of the child's experiences of care, which makes total sense. That is to say that the internal working model reflects that child's experiences of the caregiver to some degree. You know, that's really unsurprising. But what that means is that actually the internal working model is the kind of white fluffy bits on top of the wave, and it's actually caregiving, which is what's important. So Bowlby was getting the cart and the horse the wrong way around when he was emphasizing internal working models in his early work. That's my impression anyway.
Thanks, Robbie. So there's been a question from Ross that has been getting a few thumbs up, so I'm going to read it for you. Ross is asking, would you agree that to support social workers, developing a safe haven and security in professional supervisory relationships would be beneficial for working in this field? Should organizations aim to provide this to social workers? Very interesting.
Yeah, tremendous question. Lianne, Sarah, I know you've been thinking about these kind of things. Do one of you want to take this?
I can add something and then you might have other things, Lianne. So one of the concepts that was raised earlier, the idea of mentalizing and thinking about the underlying mental states for making sense of behavior. What's been found is that that's a capacity that can temporarily reduce with stress, as well as us all having different kind of baseline levels of that capacity as well. So absolutely, the more that social workers can be supported to be able to be present, to reduce their stress, which is impacting on their ability to mentalize families, the better. Also, the less support there is for social workers, the more likely we are to have turnover, and the more we can increase the chance that social workers could potentially become a secure base and safe haven for children or for families, the better as well. So as well as for the fact that you are all human beings and deserve support in and of itself, to help you to do your jobs to the best of your ability, absolutely, that would be useful from my perspective.
Rich, Lianne, do you want to come in as well?
Well, I have nothing to add to what Sarah just said. I just wish I had this in my own training as a social worker. Rich, do you have?
Yeah, anecdotally, there's no doubt in my mind that my manager functioned as an attachment figure when I was working as a caseholder in social work and child protection. Like, I couldn't remember walking back into the office and being physiologically more regulated each and every time I'd go out on a difficult visit, and then I would come back. Even just seeing her would be reassuring to me. I wouldn't necessarily need to even speak to her or download what happened. And I think Sarah's point is a really good one around the capacity of social workers to be able to mentalise with parents and hold on to multiple perspectives, which I think is a key skill in effective social work. And that is in part facilitated and developed by a supervisory relationship that develops those skills. I think one of the really key findings, or one of the ones that I found especially interesting from the mentalisation literature, was that your capacity as an individual to mentalise about another individual is in part contingent on the relationships that you have around you. And so if you have a supervisory relationship where you feel held and supported, that will have in turn, that will have an impact on your ability to be more empathic or compassionate and thoughtful towards the parents that you're working with. But with all of that said, I do know that the level of pressure and stress that social workers are placed under, for me, it like reinforced. I developed a kind of compulsively inhibitory strategy when I was growing up, and the conditions of child protection really only served to reinforce the need for that strategy. There was very little space for my feelings, because you had so much to do, and so you couldn't really have. You didn't really want to take them into consideration too much, and so yeah, it's definitely worthwhile pursuing, and it's a very difficult problem at the moment.
Thank you.
I'll just add one more thing. Sarah's doctoral research found an interesting finding, looking at whether social workers' own experiences of attachment relationships influence their practice. Sarah, do you want to say a word about this? Because I think it does perhaps relate to supervision.
Yes, so linked to some of the points earlier about how in attachment theory, it's not the experiences you had in childhood per se, but the way you now make sense of them that has been predictive of differences in behaviour. And I conducted the adult attachment interview with social workers, asking them about how they now perceive their childhood experiences. And I found that those who are called autonomous, according to the adult attachment interview, which means regardless of whether their childhood experiences were more difficult or kind of more positive overall, those who were able to make sense of those experiences in quite a coherent way and talk about those experiences in a coherent way were more likely to show higher mentalizing when they were discussing two cases that were a proxy for written initial referrals. So they were more able to think about the possible underlying mental states for the parents and the children's behaviour in these initial assessment cases. And I think, again, that links back to this idea that what we don't want to do, as was highlighted earlier, is overrun from one finding. and we don't yet know just how important that capacity is for social workers. But what it does show is that our own personal attachment related thoughts and feelings can come into the workplace and have an influence on how we think.
Wonderful. Well, to close off this session, Lianne, Rich, Sarah, and I would just like to thank you so much for coming. It's been wonderful to have the chance to think about these things together. And it's made me really happy to see all these points in the chat and loads of stuff that we'll get to think about afterwards. As I said at the start, we're hoping this can be the beginning of a conversation rather than, you know, like a briefing and then you go off and as Sarah said, it's about asking better questions. And in that regard, we're really keen to connect with you after the session to continue the conversation. So if you've put your email address down, then we'll certainly be getting in touch. Sincerely, thanks for coming. It's lovely to see you.
Just to add one thing for those who were scribbling down my email address from the slides, it's an L, so it's sarah.l.foster. We'll get in touch with those. I've been copying the chat.